Hi, my name is Erica, creator of the YouTube channel and blog TsundEri, where I talk about anything and everything having to do with anime. Welcome to my podcast, Nerds at Work with TsundEri, the podcast about nerds who turn their passions into thriving careers or carved a niche within their industry. I'm super excited for today's guest, Katrina Leonoudakis. Katrina is a professional translator and localization expert who has worked on projects in various mediums, ranging from movies and TV to video games, manga, anime, and more. Her past work includes being a localization producer for the Amazon Studio series Citadel and working as a translator for Persona 5, among many other media. Without further ado, here's Katrina. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy you're here. I've been following you on social media for a few years, and I love I just have to geek out for a bit.
Please, no, go right ahead.
It's
We're gonna
nerds at
geek.
work. So I first found your account on Twitter back when it was Twitter, when I can't remember specifically what anime or manga it was, but I just remember, you know how people when they're watching or reading a series, they see one slight like thing that's different in the translation than what they thought, and then all of a sudden it's like all hell just breaks loose.
hmm
Um, and you did a thread explaining like the reasoning behind the translation was the way that it was. You've done this before with different like, and we'll get into this later with like,
hmm
how translation works, and it was just so exciting and interesting for me to watch because I'm a huge anime nerd, so I watch it subbed or dubbed,
hmm
but I also know that regardless of how I'm watching it, it's a translated work no matter
Right.
what. Same thing when I watch like Bollywood films or anything. It's like any type of foreign media. It's a translated work, and it was just really cool to see like the process or like get a glimpse of the theory and everything behind it. So I'm really excited to have you. As soon as I saw, I was like, I need to have her on my platform at some point for something. So I'm really excited.
Oh, so I'm glad to be here. I mean, any opportunity I get to be a super nerd about translation theory and whatnot is always a good time for me. So, the more people I get to expose to it, the better. So I'm real happy to be here.
This is going to be a really good episode. I feel it.
Let's go.
So the first question that I always ask anyone who's on here is, what does being a nerd mean to you?
I think you can be a nerd about anything. Obviously, there's the generic, like when you think of a nerd, they're usually like somebody who's into something a little more like computery or like super geeky, like your typical kind of thing. But like I've met people who are like American football nerds, like not just your football fan. They're like, oh, that guy's a nerd. He knows all the history and the facts and whatnot. So I think as long as you're knowledgeable about something and like passionate to the point where it's not like more than a normal person, you can still be a nerd. Like you can be a nerd about anything, just as long as you're like that hype and that knowledgeable about it is my idea.
I agree. And that's a sentiment that most people have had on the series, like shares that it really just, if you're passionate about something that you're just so excited to talk about it and share it with people, like you're a nerd. I once knew someone who was a huge nerd about rocket launches, and
That's cool.
it was really cool. And it was funny because he was sharing it with me, and then halfway as he's sharing it, he's like, "Oh, this is probably really weird. You don't want to hear about that." And I'm like, yeah, I do actually. What do you mean? Talk about it. Like, this is really cool. I've never. And we started watching rocket launches together and stuff. So it was like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's just fun. And it's cool to connect with people and maybe put people onto something through your nerddom. So for sure.
I feel that.
So obviously, I'm sure you love to like nerd out about like translation and like language. What are some other things that you love to nerd out about?
So I have some other nerdy things that I like. I'm really into airplane logistics and air traffic control. I think so. So I mean, it kind of falls under the umbrella of I'm really passionate about project management or like how things get from A to B. So for me, I mean, I fly a lot just because like my family lives all over the place and like I spent a lot of time in airports just like killing time. And it's always really interested me because like airplanes like already crazy like engineered machine. Like you're literally in I forget which comedian said this, but you're in an aluminum tube like speeding through the sky, but the amount of logistics you have to do to like get all the people seated and how do you get the airplanes moving around the tarmac? I live right next to LAX, which is one of the busiest airports in the world. I think there's a plane takes off and lands every 60 seconds there, which is nuts. And they're huge. I don't know. I'm just really into like how do they like the rules and the logistics? How do you plan a flight getting in and out? How do you what's there's like standardized language that aircraft use with ATC to get everywhere. It's just really fun. Like I love going to the airport like 2 hours early, and then I have an app where I can listen to like the tower talking to the airplanes, and then I'll find some place to sit, and I'll just like, oh, that's that airplane. He's gonna make it right there, and he's gonna go there, and it's like really fun just seeing them all take off and land. So that's one that's one really strange thing that I'm nerdy about.
That's so interesting. I think about that too. After it's not so this is different method of mode of transportation, but
Hmm.
after I think everyone has probably gone through this phase at some point. So there's a time when after I watched like the movie Titanic, I was really
Yeah,
like I was like obsessed with like ships and how especially back in the day like how
yeah.
they would get from one place to the next with like the technology that they had because in my brain I'm thinking to myself like how could they have made sure this never happened again? So I was like, or like how like what happened that
Yes.
this messed up so badly?
No, I'm the exact same way with aircraft stuff. There's a great channel, I believe it's a Canadian agency that does accident report kind of like reviews that it's like supposed to be education for pilots. But it talks about like, hey, here's an accident that happened. Let's go through each stage of it and see what happened. Like, he didn't do his weather briefing correctly, or the plane was overweight. But at the end of the accident, it says like, how do we prevent this? Because even though it was like a broken part or something, what everything is like a chain of events and whatnot. So like there's always a little something I can learn and apply to like my own project management or stuff, but it's also just really interesting seeing how, like you said, like how these accidents kind of lead together. One thing with like ATC language is a lot of that has been standardized after certain accidents. For example, the Tenerife accident, where like two 747s plowed right into each other. Horrible accident, like hundreds of people died. But the reason was because they didn't standardize one of the reasons obviously was they didn't standardize the lingo for when you're allowed to take off or land. So the interruption in the radio made it sound like they were given the approval to take off when they actually hadn't been. So now they have standardized language where the only time the radio people will say take off is if they're giving you permission to take off. Every other time they'll say like, oh, when do like turn heading 060 after departure, or like on departure follow this heading.
Ah,
They will never use the word takeoff unless they're specifically saying like American Airlines flight 4, you have permission to take off.
oh, that is so interesting.
Right? Anyways, that's one crazy thing I'm nerdy about.
I think that is so cool and that is so different and it's funny because we fly all the time or we use
Hmm.
transportation all the time so it's always interesting to like kind of think about like okay but what are the mechanics of how does this work like even as a kid like I liked flying as a kid but even part of me was
Hmm.
like how are we suspended in air right now
It's crazy. Like the amount, like not just the engineering, but like the amount of manpower and like organization on the back end, like the tower stuff. There's, even when you're away from the airport, they're talking to different radio coordinators. Everything is so fine-tuned down to the wire. Like, I mean, flying is obviously so much safer than driving and whatnot. It's really incredible how the system is, even with things like weather delays and whatnot, like it runs so efficiently with the amount of moving parts. It's really, really cool.
yeah, there's a lot of people like that are behind that to make sure everything runs the way that it is,
Oh
So
yeah.
that it's always that's also like the nerdy thing in me, and I think the nerdy thing in most nerds like we just want to know like the mechanics of everything. I think
Yeah,
that's so
how does it
cool.
work? Why does it work? What can we do to make it
Yeah,
better? Yeah.
and that's why I was excited to have you on here because I was like, how does translation work? How does localization work? I watch anime, I read manga, I consume like foreign films all the time. Like, how does this? How did this get here?
Mhm.
um, So that brings me to my next question. So, when and how did you develop an interest in translation and localization, or just language in general?
So, I was a weeb in high school, guilty.
Weren't we all?
I I was really into anime. I literally had like an Edward Elric Full Metal Alchemist jacket that I wore every single day. I was that. And my friend wore the Naruto headband. Oh yeah, like 2006 height of weeb. And for Christmas my dad bought me a book called A Basic Japanese Through Comics because I had started collecting manga. We didn't have a Japanese program at my school, but I was like always, going on about that weird Japanese stuff. So my dad got me this book. And the cool thing is it wasn't like a textbook for Japanese, but it went through like it did some basic hiragana, and then I was like, okay, each chapter is about an interesting part of the Japanese language, and then examples of it in classic manga. So like one whole chapter was about gender. like you use different first person pronouns, and here's how you would translate those. And there was a whole chapter about like, here's some weird things with kanji, and here's how kanji work, and like how you can do different puns with certain kanji and whatnot. And like, because it was so focused on like, here's why this language is really interesting, and how like it really broke down how you might translate that or how you might work that in English. I thought for me it was like a logic puzzle but like buried in language. And I was like, that's really freaking cool. So that started me down like, I want to learn more Japanese, I want to read more about this. What other weird stuff about this language can I get into? And then a little bit after that, I think it was sometime around late 2007 was when I started fan translating. I knew just enough where I could look up anything I didn't know. And I mean, the internet was there. So, and I didn't know a lot of stuff. So I was just Googling stuff, throwing it into the Japanese dictionary, getting my results. A lot of bad translations, but, at the same time, being somebody on the internet who could speak Japanese or could translate something made you an instant asset in any fan community. Where it's like, hey, I love this person's like Twitter comics. Can somebody translate it for me? Boom, I'm there. I can translate it. And looking back on it, they were very stilted. They weren't very good. They might have been completely wrong, but immediately you would get tons of people like, oh my God, it's finally, I wanted this translated. Thank you so much. So it was really that, like, it was almost addicting, that rush of like, hey, I can do something a lot of people can't. And people are instantly really thankful for it. So I think that was the driving factor where I was like, oh, I want to translate now. Like, I never thought of it being my career. I was actually planning on becoming like a marriage and family therapist for a really long
Oh,
time.
interesting.
Yeah, I went to school. I went to UC Irvine for psychology, was my original bachelor's. And then once I got there, I'd been fan translating about a year and a half by the time I got to college, and I was probably spending a good 15 to 20 hours per week fan translating just for fun. Like in class, at work, I worked at like an IT help desk. So when I wasn't doing IT work, I was fan translating whatever manga or like Twitter comics I was finding. And again, it was just like kind of a constant cycle of instant gratification. And I was all learn, and the more that I translated, the more that I learned. Like obviously, the more you do, the better you get. So I said, well, I might as well take some Japanese classes too, just for fun. I'm taking this other Japanese class. I might as well add the double major because I'm going to be taking them anyways. Oh, I am going to graduate early. I might as well do a semester abroad in Japan. And then it wasn't until I was in Japan during my semester abroad, it was my, I think, fall of my senior year. I was applying for grad schools, and I was like, I couldn't find an MFT program I really liked. And I'm like, if I'm going to be spending $1 gazillion on a program, I better like it. And then one of my professors at UCI was like, well, how come you haven't looked into translation programs? Don't you really love Japanese? And I'm like, well, yeah, but like I can't make a career out of that. They're like, just look at the program. So I did, and then as soon as I looked at the programs, I'm like, oh man, this sounds really cool. Oh, I would rather learn this than like boring therapy stuff. So I ended up applying to Kent State and the JET program at the same time, got into both. So I did a year on JET, and then I ended up doing my 2 years, getting my master's in translation. And now I'm here.
That, like, first of
So
all, as soon as you started, when you said, "Oh, I was doing fan translations," I was like, "Oh, this is OG right here." Like, that's back in like back before anime and manga was as accessible as it is now.
mhm.
Fan translators got us through. They were the
I
backbone of
I did
society.
I did a lot of manga. I wish I could go back and count the number of chapters I released. It was a lot. It was at least it was more than 500 for sure. I was prolific. I was a problem to publishers. Yeah, actually, I made the mistake when I was applying for my first jobs as like an actual professional translator. I put my fan translation experience on my resume.
Oh,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I wanted to talk about like, look, I've been doing it for about 8 years at that point. And again, I was prolific, but I wanted to show like, look, I can do the output. I have more experience than some rando that you're hiring straight out of college who's never done a translation before. Like, I will stop fan translating immediately and like purge everything from the internet as soon as I get hired. But like, FYI, I care a lot about this. Um, and I got some people who did not look at it and said, whatever, we'll hire you. So I ended up getting hired at Sentai around then, doing anime, which was fantastic. I was just looking for an internship because we were recommended to do an internship over the summer between our first and second year of grad school. So I was basically, I was applying everywhere at that point. Like, I wasn't even looking at like actual anime and manga until a friend I played D&D with was like, "Why the hell haven't you applied for Crunchyroll, you idiot? Like, you're a weeb. You'd be a shoo-in." I'm like, "Well, but my professor told me that like that's not gonna make me money." And they're like, "So just get your interest." But I applied for Sentai Filmworks, and they're like, we don't want you as an intern. We'll just hire you. Like, we need translators." So it worked out for me. So they didn't care. But I applied to a couple different manga companies. And it's very funny. Ben Applegate, who works for, I believe, he was at Kodansha, I believe, at the time, made this massive tweet thread, like going off that, just like, this dumb idiot applied to work here and is like, some of the manga we publish are on their fan translation record. Like, they have like a perfect end to like all this other good stuff. I want to hire them, but like they're like spitting in my face. Like, I can't believe the gumption of this person. And it was very funny because like maybe about 6 years after that, once I started getting a Twitter following,
Wait,
I
so wait,
mentioned,
was he talking about you?
yeah, he was talking about
Oh my
me.
goodness.
I mentioned that on my Twitter. I was like, yeah, like we need to, I think, like, especially for people my age who are coming into the industry, like all of us have done some sort of fan translation. Obviously, like the older guard has a lot different feelings about fan translation because it really did slash does still affect like sales nowadays. Especially when fan translation was so prolific in that kind of like late 2000s, early 2010s. So I completely understand the reaction. But I made a whole tweet thread to be like, yeah, like, so this somebody in the industry said X, Y, and Z about me. And then Ben Applegate followed me and he was like, "Oh my god, that was you?" And I'm like, "Surprise, it's me." And he was like, "I had no idea." And I'm like, so yeah, no, we hashed it out. He DM'd me. He's like, "I'm so sorry. Like, I definitely shouldn't have been so harsh." I'm like, "No, I was an idiot. I shouldn't have put that on my resume in the first place." But I mean, experience is experience. And I mean, when I was at Sega, most of the translators I talked to had done fan translation, but depending on what part of the industry you're in, fan translation is looked at either as a kind of blip on the radar, or you were literally killing our industry for 10 years. What is wrong with you? So I've
Yeah, it's
reformed.
very
I haven't fans translated
polarizing.
since then. Yeah, it was very interesting for sure. But yeah, I mean, nowadays the most of the fan translation you're seeing is probably in the manga world, but there's so many simulpubs of normal stuff. I mean, simulcasts killed fan subbing basically, unless you're doing like a J drama that's never going to come to Netflix or something like that, or like the tokusatsu stuff, but or old stuff. But yeah, no, I mean, fan translation is basically dead. I mean, Japanese translators, people can run stuff through machine translation now, and the fans who are going on these ad-ridden sites just to read the manga don't really care. They just want to be able to read it quick and get it over with. So yeah, it's a very interesting place to be. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I got off topic.
No,
Anyways.
like this was all, like I'm just listening, like oh my gosh, because it's I've been watching anime and reading manga for years. I started watching anime when I was like 3 or 4. As soon as I was
Mhm.
able to retain like somewhat long term memory, is when I remember watching anime.
Uh-huh.
And then manga came shortly after. Like okay, I could read words now. I could start reading manga now. but
Yeah.
um, but for the longest time before it was accessible, we
Mhm.
were before you could get simulcast, before you could like stream it on Netflix or whatever, we're going on whatever websites.
Going on
YouTube used to
YouTube, watching
you
it burned into 3 parts.
yes, back when
Yeah.
YouTube was like truly lawless and you could
Oh,
just be
yes.
uploading like sometimes like I think to myself, I was like, wow, I was really watching Yu Yu Hakusho just on YouTube, like
At like
full episodes.
240p. Oh yeah.
Like it was nothing, and they
Oh
had
yeah.
people that would post tutorials on how to like upload anime to YouTube. As if this is like, yeah, it was a lawless land. So it's interesting to hear your story because there are times when I wonder, like, I don't know if you wonder this too. If you ever think about like, huh, that person that made that AMV I really liked like 10 years ago. I wonder what they're up to, or like that person who did that like Attack on Titan abridged. I wonder if they're like doing comedy, like writing or something like that.
Oh
One of
yeah.
them had to end up writing for SNL because Attack on Titan abridged was hilarious.
It's actually, it's so funny that you mentioned that because like because there's definitely a few very prominent members in the fan translation community are still or have now graduated, quote unquote, into the actual industry. So it's very funny every once in a while because like some of them, a lot of, like, I don't use my fan translation name anymore, and I hope nobody ever finds it out. But every once in a while, like, I'll be like, "Oh, you were a fan translator?" They're like, "Yeah, I was with GG," and I'm like, "Oh, I'm fan translation name." They're like, "Oh, I know you. We were like on the same forum forums and like you posted that tutorial thing and whatnot. So it's almost like a little secret society of like, oh yeah, I see you. All right, we were in
It's
the
like
trenches
it's like
together.
we were
Um,
there.
yeah, we were there. So it's really interesting to see that. But yeah, I mean, like I said, like a lot of people who fan translate try to go into the industry because like again, it's something we're passionate about, something we love, like and again, we have that experience doing it versus somebody who's coming out of school and maybe hasn't translated something like especially like this before because translation is a skill in itself outside of just being able to speak the language. I mean, there's listening, there's being able to speak, and then there's being able to translate. They're all separate skills.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the next thing is so there's translation and localization and something, and I genuinely don't have the answer to this, so I'm really curious. Are What is the difference between the two? Can they be interchangeable? And then the second part of the question is so what does the work look like for either a translator or a localizer?
Absolutely. And this is one very common misconception about translation and localization is that they are two separate things. Typically, the misconception is, oh, translation is you're just translating the words like as closely as possible, and localization is when you take a rice ball and make it into a jelly donut. Kind of yes and no. The first thing that everyone needs to know is that there is no translation without localization. Localization is a process of translation in the same way that like baking is this part of the process of cooking like a pie. Um, the baking is part of making the pie, but you might just say, "Hey, I baked a pie" versus "I made a pie." Um, so, with that regard, localize. So the translation process is just the process of taking the meaning of something. So, for example, if you're translating a book sentence, you're going to take the meaning of that sentence and translate it into whatever your target language is. So for me, I'm translating from Japanese to English. I actually don't go the other way, which is a lot of people wonder. I only go Japanese to English. And part of the reason is because my native language is English. I know what natural sounding English, at least American English, sounds like because I speak it natively every day. I know the expectations for a native English speaking audience. I know what grammar will sound good, what grammar won't sound good. I know how characters should be expected to speak in certain genres. Like all of that comes with being a good writer in the target language is extremely important. And that doesn't mean like, oh, I'm good at making my own fantasy stories. Like it's very much just the technical part of are you a good writer of anything? Like if somebody dictated a story to you, could you write that story down and make it sound good?
Yeah, and having like a command of the language
Yes,
basically.
so the command of writing or speaking the language if you're an interpreter is very important. So when it comes to localization, this is something that we do within our own language or even within like our own lives. So for example, if you're telling a story, you're going to tell the story with different words if you're talking to your best friend versus you're talking to your grandma. Or if you're writing that story down for a college essay, you're going to use different words, different levels of formality, probably not going to swear as much in a couple of different parts. So that's part of localization is understanding, okay, who's my audience? Who am I talking to right now? And what kind of language is appropriate for talking to this person? We do localization in software when we bring things from the US to the UK. Because there are different spellings for words in the UK, those have to be localized. There are different terminology, especially like car parts or things like that. Those also get localized for the UK. I mean, Harry Potter, I believe, the version we read when we were kids was localized from the UK to English. Instead of Sorcerer's Stone, it was Philosopher's Stone originally. That's
Oh,
a
that's
localized
right.
title. It was localized because they didn't think American kids would think philosopher was as cool as a sorcerer.
You just unlocked in memory. It was Philosopher's Stone at
Yes,
first.
that is an example of localization.
Oh
Um,
wow! My sister
exactly.
used to have the books, and I'm like, and it just yeah, it was. That's so funny. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
so interesting.
yeah, and they also other changes they made in Harry Potter was in the British version, which is the original version, he says Happy Christmas. Of course, localized for American
You
English,
say
it's Merry
Mary.
Christmas. Very small changes, but for a young reader audience, which is the audience that we're going towards, it's going to sound less jarring. It's going to be more quote unquote comfortable for them. It's now in their localization, it's in their locale. Their localization is that's what it does. Ugh.
Yeah, because if I was a
Anyways,
kid and I read
yeah,
"Oh Happy Christmas," I'd be like, "Why do they say Happy
why do they say it
Christmas?"
like that?
Yeah,
Is this book wrong?
yeah.
Exactly. When it's just really a different language. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about localization. It's not censorship, though it can include censorship. For example, if I'm working on like original TV show for Apple TV and there's an explicit sex scene where like maybe you don't see genitalia, if that's getting adapted for something like the United Arab Emirates where they have laws about you can't show sexuality on TV, there's certain different laws like in Japan, if you have any kind of nudity of certain body parts, it has to be censored or put like a little blur over it. That has to be done. That is part of localization. And that's just again following laws and rules and whatnot. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of people kind of cringe backwards when they hear localization, like, oh, you're changing it, you're making it a jelly donut, you're adding stuff in that you don't need. And in the end, it's really just considering the audience and language that you're bringing something to and thinking about how do I best adapt this work for that audience. And it can be every as simple as just changing color with no U to color with an U, or it can be something like we're going to adapt this really cool show for kids TV, but we want it to be interesting. So like Power Rangers was a heavily localized version of one of those Sentai shows in Japan. I mean, they literally just took the cool Sentai parts and added in like American actors, and then they just had the same cool Sentai parts. But that's in itself is localization. Pokemon name changes, localization. Like Squirtle isn't Squirtle in Japanese, it's Zenigame, but it is much more memorable in English as Squirtle.
Yeah, and we
So
make the connection to like what he can do or what the Pokemon can
exactly.
do.
Exactly. So, yeah. So, like I said, it is a process that's part of translation. You can't translate meaning without understanding your audience and how they're going to interpret that meaning. Which means you may change the wording around a little bit. But again, it can be as small as something like a spelling and as large as cutting off whole swaths of TV show to make it adaptable.
And there's also, I mean, I don't know if it works, if you've experienced this, but when I've interviewed voice actors and they've had to, change the way they say things or do something differently than what would be in the subtitles, people sometimes like try to come for them, but then they'll say, this is what the client wanted. This is
Hmm.
what, so sometimes it's like, is that something that you've experienced where it's like, maybe the client is like, hey, I know this says this, but for here we want to go in this direction. Like, has that happened?
Absolutely. And I mean, in the end, localization is a business. So a content creator could be like a TV producer or the manga the company that's publishing it says like we want to publish this here, but we want the title to remain the same here. Like we definitely did not choose the name Attack on Titan. That was just the name that the author came up with, and they really want to use that name, so we're going to go ahead and use it. They don't want us localizing that. Or sometimes the creator may be able to speak both languages. When it comes to Parasite, the Korean movie that won a best, I don't want to say best movie, but the
It won an
best
award.
feature film. It was
I was
best
up
feature
that
film.
night.
I can't remember the actual wording for it. I'm a terrible linguist. But the director speaks some English, so he was able to work hand in hand with the translator who's worked on most of his films, and say, hey, I want this translated like this. Look, he can look over the translation and say, I would prefer this way. And again, whatever the client wants, the client gets. It's our job as either a translator or as a producer. I'm often going back to our clients and saying, hey, I talked with the Spanish translator. They took your feedback. They have some ideas about how maybe we can workshop this. But in the end, like if we provide all the information, all the knowledge went on, the client still says we want it this way, it's gonna be that way. Whether it's a name spelling or removing something for a certain audience, there's a lot of stuff we don't have control over. Well, one thing to mention too about the difference between things that are in subtitles and things that are in dub is that the mediums are very different for the script. For subtitles, we're usually constrained by the length of the shot, and people can typically read faster than they can speak. So we can cram a lot more information to a subtitle than into maybe 5 or 6 lip flaps. So very often you'll see people saying, well, why is the dub script so different from like what they're actually saying, or the subtitles are so different from what they're actually saying? I'm like, well, that's because they can't say all that in the same kind of lip flaps. So yeah, it's interesting, and that's one thing that makes, I guess, a media localization so interesting to me is that, with a book, you have so much more freedom to move sentences around. You can change stuff. You can take one sentence and turn it into multiple sentences to explain something really cultural. When you're working with these additional constraints with audio and video, you've got certain lengths of cuts. You've got certain words are being emphasized. You could have it immediately when they say a word, it could cut to a picture of the thing that they're talking about. And now you have to include that word. You aren't allowed to write around it anymore. You're like, all right, how do I make this work in the translation so people see it and can link it together versus ignoring it completely? And then they go, well, why did we just flash the shot of a watermelon when we didn't mention a watermelon kind of thing? So it's a really interesting, these kind of constraints that we have in different forms, whether it's a game or an anime or something we're dubbing. These constraints affect how we translate things and eventually what the final script ends up looking like. So I just think it's neat.
It's a lot of different factors that I think most like casual viewers wouldn't think about, and that's why when I'm on social media, this is like my own personal thing. I always roll my eyes a little bit when people kind of and I'm sure you've seen this too, where sometimes people will almost take it personal the way things are like done, like if, like the way a translation or localization is done, or the way like say a voice actor interpreted a character. And it's like they're not just getting in the booth or doing these translations just willy-nilly. There's a lot that goes into it. And I used to work a bit in like TV production for local news, so
Hmm.
we would get people calling and complaining about certain things, and it's like, you don't understand the amount of constraints I have to navigate to bring this hour show to you.
Hmm.
You know, so it's always really cool. That's why I want you on here, because I want people to kind of understand there's a lot of different constraints and factors that have to be considered in order for a subbed anime or a TV show or a film or whatever to come out for you to be able to enjoy it. It's not just, okay, we're just gonna get back and like, Google Translate this. It's like, no, there's there's
Oh
a
yeah.
what's it protocol. There's things you have to do.
Right. And I think, and I mean, and this goes for everything too, not just for anime or nerd stuff. It's always easier to assume something's being done on purpose or being done maliciously when the reality is it's just so much more complicated than that. I mean, that's how people fall into conspiracy theories. Wouldn't it just all be easier if we were being run by lizard people versus the complex socio-political environment that we live in with however million people is in the city? So no, I completely understand why people are reacting the way that they do. But yeah, I mean, like anything, everything is complicated. Nothing is made in a bubble. There's so much at stake. There's so much that we're thinking about when we put in. And sometimes things like mistakes happen. So like someone's like, "Oh my God, this translator translated this wrong. They must be stupid." I'm like, "No, they probably just misread this 2 for 20, and then didn't double check." It happens all the time. Which is why people can email us and we'll fix the subtitle afterwards. And I mean, not just in anime, but like in TV shows I've worked on and whatnot. We'll get people calling in being like, "Oh, this translation was like misspelled or whatnot." We'll fix it. It's fine. It happens. We're all human.
I don't know if this was done on purpose or this is like if it just came out this way. One of the something that cracked me up. I was watching some show, and it was like an action film, and they were like
Hmm.
shooting at people, and I think I had the subtitles and like the closed captioning on, because I don't know what it is. I can hear fine, but then when I'm watching TV, I don't know. I can't hear anything all of a sudden.
Nope. I feel you.
So I had them on, and they were shooting, and the thing in the said they're instead of saying, "Oh, gunshots," it said "pew pew pew."
That's very funny.
I can't remember what show it was. I know it was on Netflix, and it was just like pew 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 every time, and it's like a serious like action scene. And I was like, I don't know if they kept that in on purpose or what, but that is wonderful. I
That's
enjoyed it.
hilarious.
I had to laugh. I thought that was so funny. So when you made me like, oh, a mistake, I was like, oh, like when you're watching a film.
I don't know if that's a
I
mistake
don't think
or
that was a mistake, but
that could have been a joke they left in and then they just decided to leave it in because it's funny. But
it was great.
that's very funny.
It was just a very intense scene, and then I would read the subtitles. I was like, oh, okay. And so I don't hear the shots anymore. I just hear like the pew pew
Pew, pew,
pew in my
pew.
head. So we were talking about like how much work goes into it.
Hmm.
This brings me to another question. I was going to get into this later, but I think now would be a good time. Like, what are some of the biggest misconceptions surrounding translation and localizing, and the work that you do? We kind of touched on it a bit, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I think the biggest misconception, and I see this all the time, even for like my mom's friends who I talk to about my work. is that translation is word to word. So if you pulled up a sentence of something, if you looked every word up in the dictionary, you should be able to understand that sentence. And that's just not true. Language is so complicated because we as humans are complicated. We live in a society. There's culture, there's history. Even within like our own friend groups, we have our own language we use with each other. Everyone's got an in joke that they have to explain to people whenever they come into the friend group. So, because language is complicated, when we translate, we don't translate word to word. We translate meaning to meaning. One of the examples I use is like if I want to say I eat cake, that's usually typically easy way to translate it. But if I'm skateboarding and fall off my skateboard, someone might say, "Oh, you ate it," um, using the expletive. And obviously doesn't mean you actually like picked up a piece of feces and ate it. It's slang for saying like, oh, you fell over, which is why you can't translate that word to word. Maybe you could look up the slang in a dictionary, but or like a specialized slang dictionary, but at the same time, that doesn't really express the same kind of meaning. So when we're translating meaning, we have to look at not just what the words are saying, we need to look at who's saying it, who are they saying it to, what's the history between these two people who are talking, what's the overarching context, where are they standing, where are they sitting, where are they in the middle of something, what's the history between the two characters, is this referencing something either within the actual narrative or is it a reference to some random like 80s Gundam, which happens a lot actually. Um, we kind of have to understand that sometimes we even have to go back into like what's the animation studio that's making it. Is this a internal reference to something that the other director has done or whatnot? Like you can really kind of go further out and out and out. Looking at things like Japanese culture, is this a cultural reference? If this is a cultural reference, what's important to translate out of it? Does everybody need to know the history of Amaterasu, or do they just need to know that this goddess is doing something silly? So there's a lot of meaning that can be packed into some very, very, very small pieces of dialogue. And as a translator, it's up to us to kind of figure out all of that meaning, find out what meaning is important to not only the story but the work as a whole, and then take that meaning and then plop it into a set of English words that does as close to equivalent process or meaning in English as it had in Japanese. Um, and like I said, language is complicated and it can be as easy as I ate cake or it could be somebody falling off of a skateboard. But we still have to make sure that same meaning is communicated as closely as possible. Um, Typically, that's how we do it. Obviously, depending on the audience we're translating for, that could be different. For example, like Disney had that old series or that old not it wasn't like a movie, it was like a short called Song of the South.
Mhm. Oh, I
If I
remember
was
that.
yes, if I was translating that for like a Japanese PhD program that wants to talk about race in America, I'm going to translate that very closely to the English. I'll probably provide some references for the language being used or some of the racial references that maybe they wouldn't understand because they didn't grow up in America or know the history of it. Whereas if I was told to localize it for like Disney TV in Japan for a bunch of 6-year-olds, I might take some things out, I may tone it down a bit, I may completely change up the language. So knowing the audience that we're translating for is also super important. So yeah.
There was a behind the scenes video of the translation for Fruits Basket, the most recent Fruits Basket,
Hmm.
and there's only two. I don't know why I said the most recent. You know what I mean? Fruits Basket Brotherhood is what everybody was calling it.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a scene where the director for the dub, Caitlin Glass, who also plays Machi in the
She's great.
show, she mentioned that there's a scene. I want to say it's in the first season where one of the characters starts quoting like a Japanese play,
Mm.
and they decided to change the reference from like a Japanese play to like Shakespeare because none of us would have gotten what he was saying or like the context of that. So instead they inserted like I can't remember exactly what it was, but I remember like everybody's like read
Shakespeare,
Shakespeare,
yeah,
like
we all take
whether
it
we
in
wanted to or
class.
not, it was
Yeah.
there. So when they did that reference, like okay, yeah, I get it, Shakespeare. And so when I watched the behind the scenes, they're like, oh yeah, it was originally something else, but we changed it because it would not have translated well, or like they would have not understood would
Hmm.
not have understood that. So you explaining made me think about that.
Yeah, no, and it's actually pretty common. That's a very common form of localization we see. One thing we actually see this in a lot is Disney movies. Is when they get localized into other countries, they'll change little parts here and there to make it more relatable. There was one that got brought up a lot when Inside Out came out. They showed how like the kid doesn't like to eat broccoli. That vegetable got changed to different vegetables depending on the country it was released in.
Really?
Yeah, I think in Japan, broccoli is just a normal vegetable. It's not like the go-to, oh, all kids hate broccoli. I think they changed it to a bell pepper. Um, and then they showed her not wanting to eat the bell pepper, which was much more relatable to the audience.
That's so
So that's an
interesting.
example. Another example I like to use a lot is also from Parasite. There's a scene where they're like forging an application to a very prestigious university. And one of the original said, "Oh, you're applying to Seoul University," but in the subtitles it got changed to Oxford. And when the translator talked about it, he says, "Yeah, I worked with the director," and said most American audiences don't know that Seoul University is a big deal because they don't think about Korean universities or that kind of prestige. But everyone in America knows Oxford is a big deal. And the whole purpose of the like application scene wasn't to show that it was going to be Seoul University. It's just the main purpose is, hey, they're doing this very prestigious thing. So that's one part of localization, but another part of translation theory is I'm already diving into translation theory is
That was
talking
going to be my
about
next question anyway. So let's go.
so there's a theory called Scopus theory, which talks about the purpose of the original should be conveyed in the same purpose of the translation. So where we might be saying we need to translate meaning to meaning, one of the things we're thinking about is like, why are these characters saying this now? And this is something I actually use a lot when I'm translating and I'm getting really stuck. Like I don't understand what's going on here. Why are they using these words? It's very helpful to take a step back and go, okay, obviously the author wouldn't have written these words for no reason. Like there is a reason that these words are here and I'm going to figure out what it is. So why is this character saying this to this other character, or like making this soliloquy or whatnot right now? What is the important thing that needs to come out of this? So in this Parasite example, again, it wasn't that it was going to be Seoul University. If the movie was about going to Seoul University and eventually the next shot is them at Seoul University, then of course you're going to keep it the way it is. But for the joke to land, it was important that the audience understood, like, oh, this is like they're forging an application to a really big university. Oh my gosh. So for the audience to have that same reaction, the purpose of that needs to be understood. And then again, they're going to change it to something that's going to cause the same reaction in the audience, which is another facet of translation theory I talk about called equivalent experience, which is the target audience should have the same, as close to, if not the same experience as the original audience. So that means if the original audience is laughing, the target audience should be laughing. If the original audience is thinking like, wow, that person's being really mean, the target audience should also think, wow, that person's being really mean. So keeping that equivalent experience is really important, especially when it comes to translating media or dubbing media. Um, so that's part of it. All right, I'm about to
I
launch
think
into
this is
another
so
thing.
cool.
I'm gonna let
I
you
think
ask
this is
your next question because I could launch into another really interesting part of translation theory. Just like just stop me,
I
okay?
think this I like I it's because it's like I just love listening to you talk about it because it's so cool. Like I don't know how else to explain it. It is
It's
just so
cool.
cool.
I feel like for me, and I didn't really learn translation theory until I went to school for it. So I did get my money's worth apparently,
I was gonna
but
ask you too, how much of how much of translation theory did you learn on your own versus how much did you have to learn in school or anything like or get like formal training or things like that?
Yeah, so I didn't know anything about translation theory until I went to school. And it was one semester in our first year of our 2-year programs. That was just Introduction to Translation Theory. And it was something I never really knew existed, but like it put a name to a lot of things that I was already doing. Um, it's hard to kind of explain, and I think I was about to say like maybe some of the reason why people find it so interesting is, again, it's like, oh, there's a name for that. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I've been doing that my whole life, there's a name for it. And it's like, yes, there's a name for it. Like people have sat down and been like, why do we do this? Why does this feel better than that? They really got down to the nitty gritty of the processes. So that's translation theory, for those who don't know, is the kind of technique and philosophy that goes behind making translation decisions, and it goes back thousands of years. We've been arguing about dub versus sub, literal versus localized, like way back between like 3000 BC. Like, this is not a new conversation we've been having. In the beginning, a lot of the translation theory and discourse came around the translation of religious texts. So you can look back into like ancient China or like ancient India, where they're talking about the translation of Hindi or Buddhist sutras, and how you're supposed to translate them. Is it an insult to deities to localize at all because this is their word down from high? Or is it an insult to translate it word for word when it's really not conveying the same meaning? So they were arguing about that then. Of course, coming about the turn of the century with Christianity, the translation of the Bible from I mean, the Bible we read nowadays in English is a translation of a translation of a translation. Like, it has gone through so many forms to get there. And I know a lot of biblical scholars can tell you, like, oh, yeah, no, like, you got to go back and see, like, what the original Greek or, the original Hebrew for some of these parts were to really understand it. But going back to, like, different translations of the Bible, there was discourse to the point where like villages would like throw bishops out of their town because they're using a different translation than the one that they're used to. Like, they hate this new translation by this random guy. Like, that's not the thing I've been saying since I was a kid. You're making this up. And again, it all goes back to like you're defiling the word of God. So there was a lot of philosophy around that. And then as soon as we got the printing press, we're starting to see more literature being is much easier dispersed. People are learning more language because trade's improving. You're seeing people start to translate, the works of Shakespeare into different languages, or translating a more ancient texts into newer languages. And as more people are translating, more people are having opinions about translation. And those opinions kind of get examined, turned into theory. I would say probably the last 100 to 200 years, we see it's hard to, or it's easy to lose things throughout history, but we've seen a lot more translation theory being written down and cataloged and kind of referencing one another as we're, becoming a much more connected world. But it's really interesting looking back at some of the discussions in, ancient China about like this guy translated the sutra wrong and I hate him for it. And I'm like, I got a tweet like that the other day. It's like humanity never changes. But no, it's really interesting. And I think we're gonna see some very interesting translation theory start to come out from film and television and probably games maybe in 10 to 20 years, because these are all new mediums. Like, writing has been going on again for thousands of years, but we've only had film for just over a century. And film dubbing, I mean, it started very soon after that. So and I think anybody who's like an old taku knows what anime dubbing used to sound like in the 90s, and now here's what dubbing sounds like nowadays. It's a very different approach, especially when you look at some stuff that was more niche or like more otaku oriented, like the Lucky Star dub or whatnot back in the day, versus like we're getting so much more stuff dubbed. A lot of the people who are dubbing are coming either from a fan dub scene or like grew up watching dubs or grew up being really into anime, versus before times there was really no history of it. So I think like I said, there's so much more technique to discover, and with that people are going to delve into why we're doing certain techniques, and that's where the theory is going to come out.
It's interesting what you mentioned about, a lot of like voice actors or people who are working in dubbing now grew up being fans of anime, where like back in the day it used to be, and you do notice that difference in anime dubs now. A lot of people don't know this, but Bryan Cranston, who was in Breaking Bad, Malcolm in the Middle, and all that, he actually
Yeah.
started out as an anime voice actor for years before. I think he was in. I could be wrong, but I'm almost sure he was in Gantz, and he was in. No, he wasn't in Gantz. He was in like a space anime. I just can't remember, but
Interesting.
it was pretty prominent, and he did a lot of voiceover work. But it was like back then, he was an actor just trying to act
Yeah.
and get money and all that. And now you still have that same thing, but then a lot of voice actors now are also just genuine fans of the medium, have been wanting to do it for a long time. You
Yeah,
can kind of
it's
see how it shapes their approach to the medium, and you see that difference. And
mhm.
it's not like necessarily like, oh, one's better than the other, but you can just kind of tell if there's that you see a bit of a difference of that, or
Mhm.
hear a bit of a difference, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think too, one thing to bring up is, and specifically in the English speaking or English dubbing world, is that historically and culturally, and I'm talking like from an American English speaking point of view, we don't watch a lot of dubbed media compared to Europe, compared to Asia. Um, I could say probably growing up, the only piece of dubbed media I watched was like a Ghibli film. Everything else was made in my language, in American English for the most part. Um, and because we don't have as rich of a history in dubbing as, say, maybe like Spain or Portugal or Japan or China does, we're not used to either both creating dubs and listening to dubs. So, I mean, even growing up, I remember people making fun of like the old Godzilla dub where, oh, there's all these lip flaps and the guy says one thing, like, ha ha ha, it's so stupid. Why would I ever watch something dubbed? There was kind of almost looked down upon, like, I don't want to call it fully xenophobic, but it was a little bit xenophobic. Like, why should I watch something made in another country that's going to be dubbed badly? So we don't have a very long history of dubbing as, say, like, again, like the European, basically anywhere that's not America at this point.
Yeah.
So
And I think that's something that people need to remember, like, or consider, I
mhm.
guess.
So I would say it's taken us a longer period of time to get to the level of dub quality that we might see in other languages, just because we haven't been doing it that long. Like, the English dubbing industry was not as prolific as it is now. And it's not just with anime, like Netflix is now dubbing pretty much all of their foreign language originals into English, and vice versa.
I've been
Um,
noticing that with their Korean dramas. I've been noticing them doing that a lot more.
Yes, yes, because they're realizing Americans will now start watching more dubbed content, especially if it's marketed really well. Like, even my parents watched Squid Game. I mean, we watched it subtitled because that's just how we preferred it. But my parents are like, "Yeah, no, the English dub was really good." And I'm like, "Yeah, like, the voice actors were really great. Like, I need to watch it dubbed again." But I think now that we're starting to come into a culture where people are like, "Oh, foreign media is valid, dubbing is not now terrible." I mean, even if we look back at the anime scene, like, people still argue subs versus dubs, but we're seeing a lot less of the, oh, dubs all suck, because dubs don't all suck anymore. Like, there's probably one or two wonky dubs here and there, but for the most part, dubs are, I would say, passable, if not good. There's some very good dubs out there.
So I will watch an anime whichever way it's available at the time is how I'll watch it. So if there's an anime that I really really want to see and there's just no dub for it, I'll watch a subtitle because I just really want the story.
Yeah.
But if I have to choose, like if they're both doing like if they're doing like a simul dub, I'm gonna choose the dub only because um and there's no shame in, to any anime fans listening, there's no shame in admitting this. um it's easier for, and it makes sense, it's easier for a lot of people to grasp something or to understand a series better or to react a certain way if it's in their own language because it's like you're already used to processing that.
Hmm.
There's a series that I love called Link Click. It's a There's a word for it for Chinese animation, and I'm blanking on it, but it's a Chinese animated series. And they I watched it subtitled first, and because that was what was available at the time.
Hmm.
So when I watched it subtitled, I enjoyed it, loved it. That's one of my favorite shows recently. But even when I was like reading the subtitles, there's just certain things that didn't click a certain way. Like I didn't understand like why a certain character responded the way they did or what their response meant. There's just things that were going over my head, but I still enjoyed
Hmm.
it. And then I think about a year or so later, they did the Link Click dub, and I watched it again, same episodes, and I was like, oh, that's why. That's what I missed. That's why he was acting like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Like it does make it, it helps.
So there's actually some really interesting translation theory about audience experience, watching a subtitle versus watching a dub. And it comes around the concept of what's called subtitle blindness. And they've done studies with people where they have eye tracking cameras, where it watches your cameras as it jets down and up and down and up and down and up, looking subtitle, looking back up, looking subtitle, looking back up. Um, and even when you optimize the subtitles so people are reading very short sentences and still looking at the screen, people are still missing a good, like, one fourth to one third of what's actually on screen. And when you look at film as a medium or animation as a medium, that's a lot of frames or a lot of shots that people took time to sculpt, to light, to put all the props in the right place so your eye is looking in a specific place. But when you add subtitles to that, it can completely ruin kind of the artistic vision of, oh, I wanted your eye to follow this line to this character. You're not following the line. You're looking down at the subtitle and then looking back up to see if you missed anything. So this is a concept that's been studied, and it ties in with this concept of equivalent experience, where if you want to have the same experience as somebody watching in Japanese, you should not be watching with subtitles. You should be watching a dub, because your eyes now are not distracted. You're not constantly reading. You are following the filmmaker's vision for the visuals that you're seeing. Because again, this is an audio visual medium. 90% of the stuff you're seeing on screen is the information that needs to be conveyed to you. So, in a sense, if it's dub versus sub, you should be watching dub, because that is more closely to the experience that you're supposed to be having if you spoke Japanese. But everyone has their preferences and they are super valid.
I just imagine there is someone who watches subs who's very passionate about it, who just heard this and they're like, "What?" But it's like, it's obviously it's whatever your preference is. I watch whatever's available, but I
Oh yeah,
love that you said that because I think that's something that people don't think about is like the vision and it's an audio visual medium.
exactly.
Um, yeah, and then I wish I could talk to you for like forever about this. I think I just think this is so interesting. Um, but uh one of the questions that I want to get into, we answered so many already,
Hmm.
which is really cool. Um, is there a project that you worked on that you remember being the most challenging to translate? And do you know like what made that project different in particular?
Yes, and people are not going to believe it when I say it. So, in the recent years, the most difficult project I've ever worked on is Reincarnated as a Sword, the anime.
Really?
Yes, I was gonna say you're gonna be like that came out of nowhere. So the reason it made it so difficult for me was it was an adaptation of a light novel, and it was an isekai based on like a lot of video game stuff. So not only was it an adaptation of something that already existed, so the translation was already there. All the terminology was kind of already predetermined for me, so I needed to make sure that I stayed faithful to that original translation. Um, but also on top of that, not only was there a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of on-screen visuals. And we translate those as well. We have the technology now, both between Crunchyroll and High Dive, where if there's text on screen, we can slap text on top of it that's in the same color. So you can have, again, that as close to an experience as possible, where it's just right there where the Japanese text is, your eyes can flick to it, and you can see what the guy is reading on his newspaper or whatnot. But because this isekai series was very based around like, oh, let me pull up my stat screen, and now there's like 500 lines of text. I had to translate every single one, and every single one of those lines of text is usually like a skill name or a stat name or a this is your special attack that he's not going to use for 10 episodes, but you better believe he's going to use it. So I need to make sure that that translation is not only accurate to what was in the light novel, but is also going to stay consistent throughout the whole series. So I think I had over 600 different terms, probably more than that in my term base by the time it was done. And I had to go search through. Anytime one of those little screens popped up, I would have to pause and be like, all right, let's find, all right, what's this skill? What's this skill? A lot of skills sounded very similar because they're like upgraded versions of the skill. But these are all things that like fans of the light novel would know like the back of their hand. They're like, oh yeah, no, it's like when you play Final Fantasy. It's like, oh yeah, cure 2, cure 3, like those are all very, very standardized. So you need to make sure that they're the same. So I spent a lot of time, and again, it's not even dialogue. This is just on-screen text, making sure that on-screen text was accurate, even though 99% of the people who watched the series probably didn't even look at it. So that's what made it challenging for me, was wanting to make sure it was accurate and conveyed all the information correctly. Versus, I mean, the dialogue was great too. I mean, I love the characters; they were really fun to work with. But it was just, I probably spent maybe 75% of my time on that series just translating those screens.
That is not something that you're right. That's not something I expected, especially when you mentioned the on-screen text, because I totally forgot that yeah, that is a thing now that you
We
have the
translate it.
yeah. So like if the character is walking by a sign or something, you'll see the text hover over the sign or something
Yeah,
like that, along with the subtitles at the bottom. So I didn't even that's a whole other like layer that you have to translate now that I
it
totally didn't
is.
think about.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to, is this important to translate or not? Like there are plenty of times where like the screen was in the background or you couldn't really see it or it wasn't important to the scene where I could completely skip it altogether. But because it was so central to the premise of the show, it was probably 9 times out of 10 I would have to translate all like 500, 600 words that were on there. But again, I think people really appreciated it. People who are fans of the light novel seem to really enjoy the show. And without that translation, it would have been lesser. People would not have had the equivalent experience. So,
And then there is another question.
yes.
After this, we have two more. But so we talked about this a little bit before recording. We've been seeing, for those who are listening who don't know this, I've talked a little bit about this on Twitter. Like I'm a full time writer outside of podcasting and content creation. And even I've seen how the writing industry in different ways has been impacted by AI. But
Hmm.
you have also seen a bit of how AI has at least began to seem to impact translating and localizing. So my question to you is, what are some changes that you think, or what do you think the future of translation and I cannot talk. What do you think the future of translating and localizing will look like? Um, with AI starting to become more prominent, and what are some things that you think should be in place or should be in motion to make sure that, I guess, the quality of translations don't deteriorate or change too much or things like that?
So I think there's a couple of misconceptions and definitions we need to put in the way first. So first of all, like a lot of people who aren't technologically savvy think like, oh, AI, like it can translate stuff on the fly, it understands everything. No, it's this all magical kind of box that you can just press a button and anything will come out of it. Generative AI is not, it doesn't understand what it's looking at. When you ask it a question, it's not understanding the question. It is taking the words of the question and then comparing it to its database of responses that is farmed from however millions of words that it's looked at. And then based on probability and machine learning, it picks what it thinks is like 99% likely to be the answer you're looking for, and it'll give it to you. So if you say, write me an essay on this, it's going to look at essays tagged with a certain thing, grab all the information it can, use the rules that it knows to put all the information into what you've asked it for, and it'll give it back to you. So it's not smart. It just has a lot of text to be able to pull from. So that's kind of number one, is that this isn't real artificial intelligence. It's what's we refer to as a corpora, which is just a collection of text, whether that text is a tweet or an essay or a book. That's what it's pulling from. I think the second thing we need to understand is that machine translation isn't new. It's something that's been going on for a very long time. Ever since computers were a thing, people have been dreaming of the Babelfish, the universal translator that we saw in Star Trek. There's this grand idea of, wouldn't it be great if you could pull out your phone and someone could speak into it and then you get the translation immediately. And as technology has improved, machine translation has gotten so much better, to the point where a lot of translation professionals and companies will incorporate it into their process. Like for example, I use a tool called MemoQ to work on more technical documents, and it's a program that's just used to pull apart documents and look at them. I have a plugin that if I click on a sentence, it'll automatically give me the Google Translate of the sentence in the top right. Or for example, if I'm working on like a synopsis of a series, I might take all 1,000 characters and plop it into Google Translate and very quickly skim over it and be like, okay, they're talking about this technical thing, they're talking about this, they're talking about this. I won't use it as the basis to translate from, but it gives me information. Um, so I think one thing that's important to understand is that machine translation is not going anywhere. It's a helpful tool, but like most inventions, that tool doesn't necessarily replace other options that you have. Like the example I always use is, it's a great jackhammer, but you wouldn't use it to nail a painting to the wall. You would probably use something else. So when we look at machine translation, again, this isn't something that's intelligent. It's looking at what the meaning of each word is. It may have its own kind of AI like corpora where it's going, oh, if you ask me good morning, I'm going to go in and find out what that kind of context could be. But machine translation isn't smart enough to understand all of the meaning that comes in a word. For example, like that skateboarding analogy, it's machine translation is probably at the part now where it understands, oh, he's probably doesn't actually mean this, because 99% of the time when someone says that, they don't mean it literally. But what if you're working on like a children's cartoon where as a crass joke they actually see the guy, actually picking feces up and be like, no, don't actually do that, like that's the joke. How can a machine understand that its intention is to be a joke, that this is slang that is now being interpreted literally? Or for example, if there's a cultural reference that we might want to add a little bit more information to or want to explain better to an audience, how does machine translation understand that we need to add that for this audience? Or perhaps again, if we're translating for a PhD program in Japan, they don't need to have the extra information. So the like AI and machine translation are not yet at the point where they can see a piece of text or ingest something like a TV show or play a game and understand not just the line of dialogue that's being said, but the meaning behind it. Like, is this supposed to be offensive? Is somebody using a slur? Is this imagery going to need to be censored in another country? Is this person talking about or referencing something from last episode, which maybe the machine translation doesn't have any information on, or there's somebody in the background that they're talking to instead of somebody in the foreground. So, like I said, there's a lot of context that, again, machine translation, the robots aren't smart enough yet. So trying to feed like an anime script or a television script or the contents of a book through machine translation and expecting that to be not only understandable, but of course at the quality that somebody buying a book in that language would expect. We're just not there yet, which is why we still need that human element. Um, Not only that, but kind of going back to what translation can do, a lot of some of these companies want to start doing what's called machine translation post editing, which we're seeing a lot throughout the translation world, not just in entertainment, but in things like patent translation, medical translation, anything that's very technical. Because technically, technically, the context for like a car battery operation manual, you don't need to know a lot about it. There's not going to be any slang. No one's talking to somebody across the room. It's very straightforward. And those are the kinds of documents that machine translation really excels at because, again, it doesn't need to think about anything else. It's really just about picking apart the meaning and conveying it in a way. So we're seeing machine translation post editing used a lot in that technical sphere, whereas where I know, or let me rephrase that. So machine translation is being used a lot in those kind of industries, and translation professionals in those industries have been most heavily impacted. Like I know translators who in 2014 were making six figures translating patents who no longer are in translation because it's all going through machine translation now. They don't need an expert. This is it's kind of an exaggeration, but they're not making as much money as they used to, especially if you look back to 20, 30 years ago. So I think in a strange reversal of luck, people in entertainment, whereas we used to be the lowest paid localization professionals because everybody wants to work in TV and movies and whatnot, we're now starting to see us stay in the field because we can't be replaced as easily. That being said, I mean, anybody who's thrown a tweet through automatic translation or has tried to machine translate something knows that what you get out sometimes is garbage. I mean, we make fun of this all the time. We used to do that, like the translation party thing where you put like a sentence in or a song in and then you translate it through like 500 times and that comes out with like gobbledygook. Um, and then people try to sing it. But, we all make fun of like, oh, Google Translate's so bad. And that's basically what happens when you do machine translation with like songs or TV or movie or whatnot. So whereas machine translation works, I wouldn't say relatively well, but it is serviceable for industries that are more technical that don't have the constraints of context. When it comes to like if you wanted to run a manga through machine translation and give it to me and say, okay, now fix this, um, that's not going to work for me. I'm going to have to translate it mostly completely from scratch because what you're giving me is garbage. But unfortunately, there are a lot of companies that believe, oh, like I can save money instead of hiring a translator to do it from scratch. I'll run it through Google, give it to them, and then pay them half the rate because it's already been translated. What these companies don't understand is, it's like you nuking like a mac and cheese Kraft macaroni mac and cheese, and then giving it to me and be like, okay, cool, I need this to be Michelin star quality. How do you fix this? It's like, well, you kind of messed it up already. I would have done better with the raw noodles, but I'll do what I can. I think it's going to depend on the company, and I think it depends on the reaction from the audience. We've seen some really big backlash from different foreign audiences when it comes to Netflix shows or whatnot. Like the subtitles get released, and somehow like the traditional Chinese subtitles were put through machine translation. We're seeing uproar from those audiences being like, "Excuse me, like we deserve better." We've seen the similar things coming from people in English speaking communities, much slower because again we don't have the same kind of history with translated materials that other languages and cultures do. But we do see that kind of backlash. In the end, we live in a capitalistic world where if companies find out that they can still break even or make a profit by putting out subpar work, they will. They'll cut every corner they can. And unfortunately, in the media and entertainment world, localization is usually the last step or the last rung of the ladder. We're usually the first people to be cut down, or when production delays happen, we're usually the people who have to deal with everything last. They're like, well, they can translate it in a few days, they don't need a few months to work on it. I mean, we could, but we'd really prefer not to. So
It's like this line. This it's like one of my favorite lines from The Simpsons. It's such a throwaway. It's when they call in this janitor to try to like fix something, or like they need him to do it quickly, and
Yeah.
then he goes, "Listen, I could either do it fast or I could do it right."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's basically what it said, and unfortunately, I mean, and this isn't just affecting translation industry; it's industry across the board. Is as companies try to make the biggest profit to please their investors, they're cutting out all the tiny corners that they can, to the point now where you're not giving them the same product. The quality is going to slip, like to the point either where someone gets hurt, or to the point where an author might say like, "Hey, this translation is garbage. Like I worked for years on this novel and you thought you could run it through Google Translate and sell it to people? Like what an insult."
And
Um,
that's what saddens me, honestly. So, I have no real gripe with AI in and of itself, because even as a writer, there are times when I have to use it, and it could be a very helpful tool in our
mhm,
day to day. But I guess what bothers me is when it's like you said, when so many companies are happy to cut corners to cut a profit, and they don't really consider that this is art. So, someone digs deep into themselves, like, because again, I'm a writer, so it's like someone digs deep within their conscious and pull a story out of their soul and labor on it for years and years, getting the
mhm.
characters right, the scenes right, really trying to convey the different layers and themes and all this stuff, and maybe even work out some personal things as they're doing this.
Yeah, right?
And then right, and then a company is like, okay, we're just going to run through Translate and just slap it out, and here we go. And it's like,
Mhm.
that's my life, my guy.
Yeah.
So, that's something that kind of that saddens me. But I do always feel like at the end of the day, maybe this is just the optimist in me. I feel like, we saw, for example, with dubs get a lot better over time,
Mhm.
because I think in part because as fans we wanted really good dubs.
Mhm.
They make anime more accessible to everyone, and we want to be
Mhm.
able to enjoy it in the way that works best for us. And so now we have, like, I think we're in, I don't know what the term is, but I think we're getting like some of the best dubs we've gotten in years in recent
Absolutely.
times. you know so I like to think that maybe over time, people will be like, okay, it really is quality over quantity. And hopefully that'll be something. That's just the optimist in me.
Yeah, I think so too. I think another important thing to remember is that AI is very much the buzzword of 2023, 2024, in the same way that blockchain or NFT was the big kind of go-to thing in the past. I mean, we can remember like 4 or 5 years ago, every single company, whether they made like rocket ships or like shoes, was like, we're gonna be on the blockchain, we're gonna have our own crazy NFTs. Like everybody wanted to get into it, and there was so much money being invested into it. Like if you could go into an investor meeting and say like, oh, we're actually using blockchain for our translation technology now, they would throw money at you because investors thought that was a big deal. So I think, and especially when it comes to these Japanese companies who want to be using AI, there's a lot. I mean, there's buzzwords about AI in the US, but in Japan particularly, there's a lot of like, oh, AI can do everything, it's magic, it's going to change the world, like kind of the same kind of language we were hearing about the blockchain or whatnot. But it's a lot more accessible now to the public than NFTs or the blockchain ever was. So I think a lot of this reliance on like, oh, we're going to use this crazy AI technology to make your translations better. It's really just the same machine translation, just maybe with one or two extra little gadgets. It's really not a big improvement over, the DeepL or Google Translate technology that we've been using already and learning how to use as translators. So again, I think within the next few years, I think AI, I mean, it's not going away. I mean, like NFTs and blockchain, like crypto's still here, just in a different way. I think we're going to see AI kind of morph and change. I can see people like writer, like you said, like using it as a tool. I don't think it's ever going to replace a human translator, not until we get programs like actual artificial intelligence that knows enough about culture, that can look at an image and say and be able to not only accurately identify who's in it and what's going on, but like how that context is relating to the dialogue and whatnot. Like machines, like I said, machines just aren't smart enough yet. And until we get there, I don't think we're going to see AI really impacting our industry in terms of like media localization, um, without it just being terrible, like spitting out garbage.
Yeah, and I mean they would have to. I just imagine an AI that somehow like just also understands like regional differences. Like for example, with the skateboarding thing in California, yeah, we say someone's eating, it means that
Mhm.
they fell. I'm from Florida. You said in Florida, it means that they did nothing all day. So like, yeah, so
Really?
you
Oh,
could so
I
like
love that.
it's particularly in Miami. So I used to live in Miami for a few years,
Mm,
and I remember Miami has a whole lot of slang
love
compared to
it.
so much. And I remember there was a friend of mine, like she was the first person I heard say it. I was like, Valentina, what are you doing today? And she's like, girl, I'm just eating. And I'm like, huh? I'm from Jacksonville. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. So it's like we don't say
Yeah,
that up there. So I'm just like, huh? I'm
that
sorry,
is
what? And
so interesting.
she's like, oh, I forgot you're not from here. I'm not doing anything. I'm just bored. If you hear someone say that, it means that they're just doing nothing. They're just
Like
sitting
watching
around doing
paint
nothing.
dry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty much watching
I
paint
love
dry.
that. And I mean, and that goes back to the thing is like language is so complicated. There's another concept in translation theory called polysystem theory, which basically means that again, we live in a society, but language exists not just within a bubble, but in multiple bubbles. So like we both are native speakers of American English, which has its own regional dialect just as American English. But you know, I'm from LA, you're from Florida or the Jacksonville and slash Miami. Let's be real. Um, there's a difference. Um, but from within LA, I'm from a certain part of LA. I am a weeb. I speak Japanese with my husband and other people, so like that comes into my language a little bit. I have a friend group who's been together for like 15 years, so we all have our own little in jokes. So like when I say a certain thing, like it not only harkens back to the original joke, but like to all the other times we've used the joke. Um, so there's so many little bubbles of that. And again, this is one part of context that, you know, robots just don't know how to detangle yet. They don't know how to ask us, hey, did you mean this or this? Which is something I can do when I talk to like the mangaka or when I talk to the producers working on the Amazon Prime show I'm localizing. Be like, hey, like Brazilian Portuguese wants to know about this reference. What can you tell me about this reference? And they can actually go talk to the scriptwriter and be like, okay, so like there's this book I was reading while working on the script and it comes with blah 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 blah. So like I said, language is so complicated and it's so interesting, but sometimes that makes it difficult. But that's the
And it's
fun
ever
part.
evolving too.
Yes, there's always new slang. I feel so old now. My little brother's like turning 24, and I do not know. I hear him talk sometimes. I'm like, man, I am so uncool. I don't know what half this stuff is. And he's like, oh, don't worry about it. Like, it's cool. I'm like, but I want to know. I want to know how the cool kids talk. Teach me your slang.
TikTok keeps me young.
I don't do TikTok. That's what I gotta do. Is I just gotta get on TikTok and like follow a bunch of younger creators and be like, yo, teach, like study your language. I'm just make my little notes.
I have friends who are, we're all in our late 20s and early 30s. And then I have friends who are like much younger. And my friends who are who are around my age, I'm about to turn 29 soon. My friends and I who are like we're about the same age. Sometimes I'll tell them what something means because I'll say it and they'll be like, "What?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, this means this." Or like their younger sibling will say something and they're like, "What the hell does that mean?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, I know what this means." It's like because I'm
Yeah,
on
yeah, yeah.
because I live on TikTok and I have friends who are a bit younger than me who help me out. But yeah, I'm getting to that point too. The thing is that, and then we're getting to like the final question. But like the
That's
thing
okay.
is like what I'm starting to lose a grasp on is how I used to know, we know like the like texting terms, right? Like LOL,
Yeah,
LMAO, all that
yes.
stuff. Sometimes I'll be on Twitter or I'll look through the comment section of a TikTok and there's acronyms. I'm like, what does that mean?
I gotta
Like,
Google them. I gotta Google them. I play Overwatch, and every once in a while, someone will post something in chat. I'm like, God damn, define blah 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 slang.
that's where I'm losing it is like the text like slang terms, but like the words I got, but it's like the acronyms. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm actually like kind of losing it. What does that mean? Oh my gosh. So the final question I have is what is the best advice you have received in your career? And then the question after that would be obviously where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, so there's two pieces of advice I got in my career. One of them comes from my master's degree professor, Dr. Wakabayashi. She's fantastic. I don't think she's with Kent State anymore, but she was very scary, but also extremely knowledgeable. I learned so much from her. And one of the exercises she did was she gave us a translation assignment. She said, I want you to take this recorder and you're going to record yourself, and I need you to talk aloud as you're translating, saying like, okay, I'm looking this up. I know this word. What is this kanji? Okay, I'm going to modulate it by this, like explaining my translation as I translate it. And then she took like a whole week and listened to everybody's like 16 hours of audio to hear how everybody was translating. And the first thing she came in was she came to class, she goes, number one, you guys look things up way too much. She says, half the time when you look something up in the dictionary, you already know what it means, but you're double checking. She says, you're wasting your time. You know more than you think you know. Do not doubt yourself that much. And that has been a godsend for me. And I think definitely for my first few years as a translator, I was very much like, oh, what if I get it wrong? What if I messed up? Whatnot? And I think some of it came with experience, but a lot of it came with like, I don't need to look up this word. I know what this word means. I can see it on screen. I know what I'm doing. I can translate it. And having that confidence to know, like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to make a mistake. Really helped me. And of course, like everyone makes mistakes here and there, but most of the time when you're making a mistake, it's not on something that you think you need to look up. It's on something really simple you skimmed over, like a number or whatnot. I misread something as a circumference instead of like a diameter once, and it like I still remember that mistake like 8 years later. I'm so upset about it. It's still on the DVD. I hate it. I can't fix it. But like those kind of things. So she really like hammered that into us. Is like, don't you know more than you think you know? Um, don't doubt yourself, which was really big for me. And then the other piece of career advice that I received actually came from my husband, where one of the things that I have a hard time doing with ADHD is like I have to go back and double check everything.
You have
But
ADHD too? Girl, me
hey,
too.
I have ADHD, I have anxiety disorder, and I was diagnosed with OCD a couple years ago as well. Hooray! The whole gamut. I mean, it's all
ADHD
like the same.
gang.
It's all the same area of the brain. Who just knows what happened to me? But I mean, it has its pluses and minuses. But I hate going like as soon as I'm finished with a translation or finished writing a chapter or something like that, I just want to send it in, be done with it. I'm done. Nope, I finished the work. I can go play now. But I know in my heart, like I need to go back and double check it, not just for spelling, but for translation errors and whatnot. And there's one time I was just complaining with my husband. I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. It's stupid. It's gonna take me like a whole hour to check the stupid episode. I don't want to do it. He goes, well, if you check it and you find a mistake, is it worth it? And I go, yeah. He goes, would you be upset if you did not take the time to double check it and then someone else pointed out the issue? And I'm like, yeah, I'd be real upset. He goes, there you go. That's all you need to know. If you check it and you find something, it was worth it. If you check it and there's nothing, then you can be upset. So that's really helped me. And then kind of going back to the ADHD thing is actually I kind of built that into like I really don't want to check, even though I know it's important to check. I don't want to do it. So I've built it into my process where I usually have to put in time codes for my subtitles about every 10 to 15 seconds. So I could do that while I'm translating, but I intentionally leave it out. So I'll usually do my translation pass and then I'll watch the video as I'm double checking my translation to do my time codes, which forces me not only to double check the translation, but also to put in my time codes at the same time. So I'm like, okay, and then 99% of the time I change like a whole bunch of stuff because I'm like, oh, I want to change this, I want to change that. And
That's
then
so similar to what I do with writing. Is like there are certain processes I'll leave for the end because then it forces me to
yeah,
go back. That's so funny.
absolutely. No,
Yeah.
it's I feel like adulthood is just learning how to trick your brain into doing the thing that you need to do. You just gotta like find the little shortcuts, be like, oh, if I put a rock here, then I have to walk around it, which makes me get more steps. Like
This is
it's
what parenting myself feels like.
it really is self-parenting. Nah, it's funny because I've added a third step now to my translation process. Because I spend a lot of time in that kind of editing process, resplitting my subtitles, and this is another part of translation that people don't realize is that the amount of information you put in each subtitle and the timing of each subtitle is really important. So you don't want a really long subtitle in a short point of time, or a really tiny subtitle spread out over a really long period of time because it looks weird. It's the same issue with Godzilla where there's a ton of lip flaps and the guy just says no. So kind of achieving that balance and also the readability of subtitles. There's a certain reading speed you have to hit, especially for accessibility. So a lot of time when I'm doing translation, I'm doing it off of a script, and the script doesn't tell you how long it takes each person to read the whole line. So I kind of have to eyeball it. Then when I'm watching the video, I'm like, ah, crap, like I have to cut this in half and move stuff around, et cetera, et cetera. I've added a new step now to the process where before I start translating, I'll watch the whole video, But as I'm watching the video, I start putting speaker names in for the subtitles so I can know, oh, this one line is going to end up having to be two subtitles, or this one should only be one subtitle. And I'll usually put the first couple Japanese words in for each subtitle so I know which one goes where. So before I've even started the translation, I've watched the whole episode from front to back. I know exactly what to expect. And I already know all my subtitle splits. So I added it in just for the subtitle splits, but now I've watched the whole episode. I know what to expect. I know what parts of the translation are going to take me longer because it's a cultural reference or whatnot. So, like in a way, tricking my brain, kind of parenting myself to do a better job has made it even better for me. So yeah, I don't know. A piece of advice: just play around with your process. There's always probably something you could be doing better.
That's amazing. And where can people find you?
Yes, so I am regrettably still on Twitter. Katrina L Translator. It's stylized. I'll put it in your linky thingy. I'm on Blue Sky now. I don't know what my Blue Sky name is. I think it's slightly close to that, but I'll have a link there. I also will be posting most of my essays on Blue Sky in LinkedIn now. You can just look me up by my real name. I've got very bright pink hair. I have purple now. It changes with the seasons, but I have very bright pink hair on LinkedIn. You can't miss it. So that's where you can find me.
Awesome. And for those of you listening, you can find me also regrettably still on Twitter at it's the TsundEri. Wait, yeah, at it's the TsundEri. It's been a minute since this is my first podcast episode in a while, so I'm like, how do I do
Hey!
my outros? So you can find me on Twitter at it's the TsundEri. You can find me on Instagram at the TsundEri. You can also find me on TikTok at the_TsundEri. And then I have my website, tsunderi.com. And also, I don't promote this enough. I have a Discord for anyone who follows my YouTube channel or anything like that. We talk about anime, we talk about manga, we share photos of cats. So if you have a cat and you want to post a picture somewhere and get a bunch of people like crying and screaming and like laughing and just being happy, please, it's me, I'm people. And yeah, and I'll include a link to Discord at the bottom of my video in a description on whatever platform you're listening to this on. It's been a minute since I've done my podcast, so I kind of forgot how my outros go, and I'm going to be very transparent about it. So I just want to say thank you so much, Katrina, for being a guest. I am so happy to finally speak to you. I love your presence on Twitter and just seeing the knowledge that you drop, and I'm glad that my listeners get to like hear it too and walk away learning something new. So thank you so much for being here.
No, I had a great time. Like I said, anytime I get to geek out about translation's a good day to me. Also, everyone should read Kageki Shoujo. It's really good. If I say so myself, the translation's always very good. I did some very interesting things with the Shakespeare in it, so I hope you will read it and enjoy it. It's really good. Have you read Kageki Shoujo yet, TsundEri?
No, but I've heard of it. I haven't read it though.
If you haven't read it, you can watch the anime. It's on Crunchyroll now because it used to be on Funimation. The dub is extremely good. If you don't know, Kageki Shoujo is about the real life Takarazuka review, which is an all female acting review. They do musicals and whatnot, but women or the AFAB people play every role from male roles to female roles to young to old and whatnot. So there's a lot of really interesting gender play there. The series, both the manga and the anime, goes through a lot of really intense conversations about, like, as an actress, how you you have to maintain your weight or your appearance. It goes through LGBT issues. It goes through CSA, like all sorts of things that affect people who are trying to go into the industry. And the English dub actually cast a lot of genderqueer and trans people to play the Takarazuka actresses or people who are playing around with their gender in the show. So again, dub's really good. It hits a lot of really cool things. If you're super feminist, you would totally love it. Also, I worked on it, so I'm biased. Oops.
No, you know what's crazy? I had heard of it. If you're listening and you're not watching this on YouTube, she just put up the manga, like a hey,
Yeah, I was working on it the other day and I had to get a reference. So
no,
the best reference is the one that you have.
I had heard of it, but I heard of it and I had heard good things, but I did not know that all of that was in the series, and I find that all interesting. So now I'm definitely putting it on my watch list for real. So I'm really glad you told me about that.
The dub is super duper good.
Awesome. So yeah, and thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you next time.